Welcome to In Focus with Ajaz. Let's begin this evening with India's war with US tech giants Twitter and WhatsApp. Last Friday, Indian police summoned Twitter's top official in the country to answer allegations that the US firm failed to stop the spread of a video that allegedly incited hate and enmity. Hate and enmity, I'm quoting from the statement of the Indian police, between Hindu and Muslim communities. A case had been registered in Ghaziabad in India's Uttar Pradesh state over a video of a few men, apparently Hindus, beating an elderly man believed to be a Muslim and cutting his beard. This is only the latest episode in the war between the Indian government and Twitter since India has tried to enforce the country's new IT rules. Back in February, Twitter accused Indian police of intimidation. The statement came days after Delhi police visited Twitter's offices to serve a notice in connection with a tweet from a ruling BJP spokesman, which Twitter labeled as manipulated. Right now, and I'm quoting from the Twitter statement then, right now we are concerned by recent events regarding our employees in India and the potential threat to freedom of expression for the people we serve. This was a Twitter spokesman. He also said, we alongside many in civil society in India and around the world have concerns with regards to the use of intimidation tactics by the police in response to enforcement of our global terms of service, as well as with core elements of the new IT rules. This is one aspect of the problem. The other, which we have discussed on this program previously, is the opaque practices of tech giants and the application to them of antitrust laws with reference to taming the four tech behemoths. Observers are already intrigued, for instance, in the US by the appointment of Leena Khan as chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Ms. Khan is an associate professor at Columbia Law School, and she came to light in 2017 when she published an article written in the Yale Law Journal, which argued that Amazon shouldn't be excluded from antitrust scrutiny simply because it had a history of cutting prices. So there are two broad issues here. One, the desire by the governments around the globe to control expression and discussion, and two, the way tech giants operate and which needs to be regulated at various levels. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Asad Baig, journalist, a computer engineer, and founder of the Media Lab, Pakistan's first incubator and accelerator for tech-based digital media startups, and Selepak, lecturer in the Department of Telecom at the University of Florida, and program coordinator of the graduate program in social media, and Gurshabad Grover. Mr. Grover is a senior researcher at the Center for Internet and Society in India. Let's begin with Mr. Grover. Mr. Grover, give us an overview. As I said, this is not, this has been brewing for some time now. An overview of, or an explainer, if you will, of what exactly is happening.
The rules, the new IT rules, were notified in February 2021. And these rules were issued under two provisions of the Indian Information Technology Act. One is the power of the government to order intermediaries or social media platforms to take down content from their platforms. The second one relates to intermediary liability, which is an area of law that discusses how Twitter becomes liable, or whether it is liable at all, for content that users post on the platform, and of course take Twitter as an example. And now what is happening is that the new rules notified by the government in Feb 2021 mandate companies such as Twitter, Facebook, and actually a whole variety of intermediaries, including any social media intermediary that has more than 50 lakh users in India, to have personnel specifically in India that are responsible for complying with government requests. And when any such company is not complying with the new rules, they become at the risk of having liability for what users post. So now what we've seen in the recent few weeks is that Twitter the common understanding is that Twitter has failed to comply with these rules. Now, police departments all over India, therefore, are operating under the assumption that Twitter is no longer exempt from liability for what users post on their platform, and therefore they are becoming a party to lots of these cases around the nation. Now,
Right.
there are obvious concerns of freedom of expression that stem from such laws, because what we've seen in the past is that the Indian government has used its power to take down content and to a wide variety of content that is constitutionally protected speech. And we saw this during the farmers' protests earlier this year and various protests last year. So the problem for freedom of expression for citizens becomes that these companies are now can be harassed into following orders that may not be legal. And this is especially worrying because surveillance and censorship framework in India does not require judicial scrutiny. So the government can send these orders directly to them.
So very quickly before I go to my other experts, so there are concerns with reference to freedom of expression and discussion, and also for these companies, as you mentioned, you seem to be implying that they enjoyed protection against legal liability for user-generated content. But how can they actually stop that content? I mean, are you saying that assuming that I have generated content which goes against the whatever the rules are, so then Twitter is supposed to block me, and if it fails to do that, then in addition to me, Twitter will also be held liable for it?
So under the previous regime and the act that exists currently, all these platforms are exempt from liability of user-generated content, provided they comply with a list of conditions. The contentious provision now relates to having localized personnel. So when Twitter speaks of that they are concerned about the safety of their employees, that's the provision they're referring to. So even now, all these social media companies are not under an obligation to proactively stop all unlawful content, but the question, one of the conditions to have this safe harbor or exemption from liability is the fact that they comply with all takedown and surveillance orders. So looking at this combination of three, four sort of legal regimes, the result is that the government can now send overbroad takedown, censorship, and surveillance orders. And if the company is fearing arrest of their employee, they are more likely to even comply with such broad orders that suppress freedom of expression and privacy.
Okay, that was an excellent overview. Let's get to Andrew Selepak here. Andrew Selepak, what's the principle, or what's the theory, if you will? There is a video. I just want to get to specifics, so from there we can sort of try and derive the broader principle. So there is a video, allegedly Hindu men in this case, attacking and a older Muslim man cutting his beard. So the Indian government is arguing that this stokes communal fires. Twitter is saying this is something that has happened and someone has generated this content, and this is something that we cannot take down. What is the principle here?
I think it's very difficult for Twitter to really have much of a place to kind of argue with here. Here in the United States, after we had the January 6th riot, Twitter took down a lot of content because it was potentially going to lead to more violence. But they've not actually acted in the same way when it comes to other countries. When it was the farmers' protests in India earlier in the year, they didn't take down a lot of content that was potentially going to cause more violence. Here we have another video that the Indian government was saying was going to cause more violence, and they were reluctant to do anything with it. So what we're seeing is that there's kind of applying different rules to different places, which I think is one of the reasons that we have this issue to begin with. And what we're looking at is if you're going to be a multinational company that's going to act certain ways in certain countries, you're definitely going to get complaints from those countries that feel as though they're being treated differently.
Okay, so yes, for instance, Trump has been banned, I believe, for 2 years or 3 years. So that's a decision that Twitter took, and this was with reference to, allegedly the incitement to do mischief. So you're saying that Twitter is using a particular benchmark within the United States and different benchmarks elsewhere. But my query still remains with reference to how do we approach something that has happened. Let's assume someone generates content in Myanmar of the Burmese security forces shooting at people, protesters. Now, can the Burmese government claim that this is something which basically destabilizes the internal situation more and therefore Twitter should take this down?
I mean, they can do that, but whether or not Twitter is actually going to take those actions is sort of where we are right now. A lot of it's going to come down to Twitter making the decision internally as to what content they're going to take down. They can also kind of place restrictions on content that doesn't make it accessible in certain countries. Although that can still be gotten around with a VPN. You can also just limit certain accounts. You can potentially even bury content with shadow banning. So there's a lot of different things that Twitter or any social media company could potentially do. The big reason that we talk about Twitter so much is because it is such a public forum of a social media platform. It's a one-to-many platform is the way that we kind of describe it, to where tweets can go viral, information can go viral. We see a lot more content from people that we don't know, that we don't follow, content from around the world. So Twitter is a very different platform than, say, WhatsApp or Facebook or even Instagram. The only one that's remotely close would be kind of TikTok, although we're talking about a visual platform versus more of a text-based platform. And we've seen that there have been problems with TikTok in other countries as well. So I think Twitter's kind of a unique situation compared to the other platforms. At the same time, there's a lot more that Twitter could potentially be doing when it comes to limiting the reach of content or blocking content. And I think what we're seeing is that they're just not doing that in a lot of instances, or it's not kind of even as to how they treat certain instances in certain places compared to others.
Right. Before I go Asad Baig with this question on the principle, how do we determine what we are supposed to do here? Very quickly, back to Mr. Grover. Mr. Grover, very quickly, I just want you to tag this issue because Twitter has also said that it has abided by Indian government's requests. They have geo-blocked accounts and done others. So I just want to get your quick take on that defense from Twitter.
Yes, so it is in fact true that Twitter has complied with Indian government requests to take down accounts. And most notably, people may remember that several independent news magazines' accounts were blocked during the farmer protests. Separately, music videos were taken down, etc. So Twitter does comply with these requests, but they also have a history of contesting these requests. So, for instance, it appears that the Indian government wanted Twitter to take down all content that related to the quote-unquote Indian variant of the coronavirus. And one can see how this is a very, very broad request that does not talk about specific content. So reports suggest that there was a tussle between the government and Twitter then about that content. But also more recently, the Indian government has asked Twitter to take down accounts of political cartoonists and specific cartoons that they have published on Twitter. And again, Twitter seems to have not complied with all of these requests. So, so legally speaking, there is a provision that allows the government to send takedown requests to Twitter, but Twitter has been contesting some of those, and that's where the tension between the government and Twitter has been arising.
Okay.
In the earlier case, Twitter had no immediate fear of repercussions in that regard, but now the new rules make it very clear that a locally appointed personnel there is a possibility of them becoming as liable as the content creator let's say in case a government ordered tweet is not taken down.
Right. So this is an point at which to get to Asad Baig, who basically looks at these issues, thinks about them. So Asad Baig, I'm still stressing what exactly is the principle here. So there is the issue of opacity. We don't know how Twitter does X in place Y and A in place B. But there's also the issue of, for instance, as Grover is saying, requests by the Indian government that are very clearly politically motivated and are meant to redound to the advantage of the ruling BJP government. So how does one walk through this sort of veritable minefield of complexities and contradictions?
I think, as we have rightly pointed out two main issues in the start of your show. One is the opacity or the openness of the algorithms or the systems of content regulation within the companies like Twitter. And the other part is the actions of the governments across the globe to take over these platforms and kind of use their own political leverages and weight to suppress some of these content on Twitter. I think in addition to that is the dilemma of incitement to violence or the spread of incitement to violence or a call for any incitement on Twitter. So by no means it has a very black and white or should have a black and white answer. In my view, I think Andrew pointed it out that one of the biggest concerns of international companies is that they don't have uniform laws. In my view, I think it's difficult to have uniform laws. For instance, that have application on the US and the same laws are applied on, let's say, India, or like you rightly pointed out, Myanmar for that matter, right? So in my view, this video that we are talking about, specifically, I haven't seen this video, but in my view, this is like a very clear-cut case of violence against a community, right? So I don't see how this is contributing or this video is contributing to the spread of violence or the spread of hatred and so on. This to me should be evidence or should be declared evidence in many ways, right? I mean, take the example of Arab Spring, for instance. Twitter, and I'm sure the role of Twitter and other international platforms is very obvious on how sort of they play the role and so on. Even so much so that groups like CNN were reporting mainly from information coming from Twitter, and they had their own mechanisms. I know because a friend working there, and they had very elaborate mechanisms to fact check the information that were coming through Twitter, but from Twitter nonetheless, right? So in a way, this instance should be treated as one of those many instances of violence that we've seen across the world, also in India, and I keep saying that 31 lynching cases between 2016 to 2018, and this should be seen as what it is, which is essentially an act of violence against an individual or maybe even a community. So I don't see how it's inciting any violence, number one. Number two, I think Grover has been very thorough in his remarks, and I don't need to add to any of what he said. But excuse me, in general, I think this case seems to be very politically motivated. There's one more thing, Ijaz, I would like to add about the whole process of taking away the intermediary liabilities from the corporations like Twitter. We have, and we still, I think we will continue to have issues and concerns with how the content is being moderated in Twitter and Facebook's, because they're all black boxes. But I think this fear is very legit, that there is this very politically motivated drive in this region specifically to take over the content moderation policies of Twitter and Facebook and other social media companies. And this idea of on one side, giving the Twitter and Facebook and other corporations legal liability in the laws and then taking them away in the rules is frankly very absurd. And at least three that I know of the UN Special Rapporteurs has pointed it out. There are various organizations like Access Now, for instance, and GNI, which have written to Indian government about how absurd these lawmaking processes and practices are. And so there is a very clear political motive behind this also. And Ijaz, let me also point out that this is not a lone practice, but we have seen these practices in other countries as well in a similar manner, specifically with regards to intermediary legal liability to make the companies more compliant.
Right. So what are the rules else? For instance, in terms of, as I said, in terms of the antitrust issue, the U.S. courts have taken a different view compared to, for instance, the European Union and also individual European countries that have fined, for instance, Amazon, Google, and certain other countries. So, certain other companies. So, what are the rules with reference to these, complex issues elsewhere? For instance, in the UK or in Germany or France or elsewhere.
I think, Ijaz, what you have to look at is the larger context these rules and laws are applied on, right? So if we are talking about a context where there are certain legal defenses, there are certain legal protections to companies, individuals, and so on, and there the policy implementation of a certain policy will be very different from an environment where there are no legal structures or in practice or policy to provide certain kinds of protections to individuals and companies. So, and this is why my belief, and this is where kind of my belief is rooted in, that it's very difficult for organizing companies like Twitter to ensure a uniform application of their rules, because the legal environments that they're operating in are very different. And so, yeah, you just cannot say that there is a certain standard. Obviously, the largest standard may remain the same, which is incitement to violence and so on. But this is one big concern, by the way, because incitement to violence is considered that uniform formula for across the platform, across the country to remove content. Now there is this attempt by various governments to kind of fit everything into that very small window. And this video, I think, is perhaps one of those examples. So, like I pointed out, Ijaz, I think we need to look at the bigger picture here, and the bigger picture is that there is a certain political motive here, and there has been a history of these political motives in the past as well.
Right. And I'm going to get to Grover on this, but Andrew Selepak, the issue of opacity aside, it's, would you agree that it's very difficult to say whether something is actually evidence, as Asad Baig is saying, and so there is a long context of it, or whether it can be argued, which governments normally do, and the Indian government is doing in this particular case, that this is something which incites violence or, destabilizes the situation, internal situation. And that's the kind of, while I do agree that in certain cases, one can make this argument, but I also believe that governments tend to fall in this argument for reasons that are less than honest.
Yes, I mean, I think what you're talking about is essentially that there's a difference between, say, an individual going on to a social media platform and encouraging others to attack an individual or a group of individuals, as opposed to someone posting onto social media an event or posting onto social media raw footage of something that occurred that could then be argued could lead to violence. And those are two very different things. Normally, when we think about inciting violence, it's a call to violence, not that you are showing an event. And there's obviously events going on around the world at all times, every day, that could lead people to be angry and therefore attack someone else or become violent because of what they have seen or what they've watched on social media. And that's where we have two very different kind of points of view. As on one side, if you're literally calling for violence and you're calling for supporters or you're calling for people on social media to go out and attack others, and then the other side is there being violence shown. And a lot of times this is newsworthy. It's news stories. It's information that the people should know of what's going on. And that's where I think we're getting these differences in different countries where there's political pressure being put onto social media, that what they're asking to have removed is not necessarily incitements of violence, but depictions of violence, and that governments or different localities are making the argument that these depictions of violence could lead to violence. But there's a kind of a predictive aspect of that you're assuming that one would lead to another because people would be upset by it. but conceivably people could be upset by almost anything. And if we're using a very broad definition, then almost anything could be an incitement to violence.
Absolutely. I think that's a very important point to distinguish these cases. Thank you so much. That was Andrew Selepak speaking with us. Now, Gurshabad Grover, you just heard what Andrew said with reference to distinguishing between, for instance, someone actually going on a shooting spree with a camera and live relaying it on, through a social media platform is clearly one thing, and recording evidence of something going on is another. As Asad Baig also said, that there's a context, there's a trajectory of this kind of communal violence, and we have seen more of it, unfortunately, under this particular BJP government. So, as an Indian citizen and as a researcher, who researches in the area of surveillance and free speech and so on and so forth, what are your concerns in the backdrop of all this, and with reference to some of the provisions of these new IT rules?
Moderating speech is obviously a very complex moral, ethical, and political question. Some things should be clear to us, though. The laws define particular acts that are criminal. And so let's take this example of the video we've been discussing today. If it just depicts the event, right? And let's say a Muslim journalist in India has posted this video to sort of demonstrate that acts of violence are happening against Muslims in India. This is a very different scenario from a Hindu right-wing person posting the same video and saying and calling for such treatment of the community at large, right? So the latter would amount to hate speech and incitement to violence. The first would be a journalistic exercise permitted and is constitutionally protected. So therefore, the thing that emerges is that such speech is obviously very, very contextual. And that's why historically, determinations of whether the law has been violated in terms of incitement to violence, discrimination, or hate speech, these decisions are left to courts. That when the governments have the power to send content takedown notices to platforms like Twitter, Facebook, there is no judicial intervention involved. So I think in terms of the first legal step, the simpler problem to solve in this array of complex problems is the fact that when the government censors speech, you should have an impartial authority like the judiciary assessing these orders before they go to platforms like Twitter and Facebook.
Okay, so on this note, and before I wrap up, Asad Baig, what is the situation here, and what do you think is different from what we have here in Pakistan and what's happening in India with reference to these IT rules?
I think what is different here is, first off, the whole idea, like I pointed out in the start of my discussion, that the idea is similar. And this is not just the Indian example. Obviously, we have a similar example of where the intermediary liability is kind of linked and not directly linked, but kind of in the rules for PECA, the law that we have, it's kind of defined in a way that is not inconsistent with the law itself. But I think the good thing, specifically speaking for Pakistan, the good thing that we experience here is the intervention of court, like Grover pointed out, is very active in Pakistan. For instance, there is this whole process of consultation on the social media rules, which was actually initiated on the order of the court, the Islamabad High Court in Pakistan. And the government has recently posted the new version of the CP rules, which I incidentally haven't had the chance to study yet. But they are supposed to be, they're supposed to be based on the feedback that they collected with and from a lot of digital rights experts in Pakistan, including some of my colleagues. So that, I think, is a good thing. But generally, like I pointed out, the idea of governments kind of attempting to take over the content moderation from the social media companies is not new, and definitely not new in this region.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Baig. Thank you also to Gurshabad Grover, who's appeared on this program for the first time. Thank you for his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss reports that Kashmiri politicians in occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir will urge India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to restore Kashmir's autonomy when they meet him on coming Thursday. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Politicians in Indian-occupied and annexed Kashmir will urge India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to restore the region's autonomy when they meet him on coming Thursday. This will be the first interface between Kashmiri politicians and Mr. Modi since he revoked the region's special status 2 years ago, in a unilateral move that many analysts consider as violative not only of the UN resolutions and Kashmir's status as disputed, but also the Indian Constitution. Modi abolished Article 370 of the Constitution in August 2019, ending the region's autonomy and removing its statehood by splitting it into the federal territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Some of the politicians set to meet Modi on Thursday were among the thousands of people detained at the time to forestall a backlash against the shock move. To discuss this further, I'm joined by John Dayal, writer, human and political rights activist, and member of the National Integration Council of India, Gowhar Geelani, eminent Kashmiri journalist and author of Kashmir, A Rage and Reason, and Ranjan Solomun, who's director of Alternatives, a consultancy that advances justice and human rights. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Geelani here. Mr. Geelani, I can see that you are on your way back from the Gowhar meeting when we caught up with you. So give us a sense of what's happening and what are the politicians who had been detained planning to, tell Mr. Modi?
As you rightly said in the beginning, that this is the first interface between the pro-India politicians, at one point in time, Mr. Amit Shah and others called as Gowhar gang. And these are the same political parties that the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, referred to as dynastic, political groups and corrupt political groups, and also referred to them and their alliance as Gowhar gang. So now it's the same alliances that they are trying to engage. And the sense is that this what will happen is they are saying that 370 restoration is not on the table and 35A is not on the table, but there will be some headway with regards to the possible return of statehood and the possible delimitation to increase the number of assembly constituencies in Jammu and Kashmir. So, but what we are hearing from the parties that are part of the Gowhar, People's Alliance for Gowhar Declaration is, number one, that Mehbooba Mufti, who heads the People's Democratic Party, she has talked about Pakistan being the stakeholder in the Kashmir dispute, and she also made some other observations. But now, under the leadership of Dr. Farooq Abdullah, who has been the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir many a time, and under his leadership, they are sending this delegation, which will also comprise, Muhammad Yusuf Tarigami, who happens to be the chief spokesperson for the PAGD, that's People's Alliance for Gowhar Declaration, and they will meet Mr. Modi and on Thursday, which is the 24th of this month. So the sense here on the ground is that the pro-India political parties are not against the engagement with New Delhi, and they see this as an opportunity that they will go with their agenda, which is the restoration of statehood and also the restoration of Article 370 and 35A. But what is on the table, because there is no agenda for this meeting as such, so it's like it's seen by many as part of some see it as that there has been international pressure. There is Beijing, there is the US, and there is also the mediation that has happened in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and there are other bilateral factors as well. But BJP, obviously, for political posturing, does not want to give that signal, and they want to be on the table from a position of strength. And they are saying let Article 370 or 35A be treated as history. But the political parties here are saying that matter is also in the Indian Supreme Court. So that is the overall mood. But the larger sense is that these parties will go and they will engage, and they are not against the engagement.
Right. Very quickly, Mr. Geelani, before I go to Dr. Dayal, is it possible that in this particular meeting, that the government tells the politicians, look, we are okay with the statehood thing, and as a matter of fact, previously Mr. Amit Shah had also spoken about a certain period after which statehood could be restored, and then get the Indian Supreme Court, which has actually been procrastinating, frankly, as far as those petitions are concerned, to say that the move was violative of the Indian Constitution in order for the BJP to save political face. And so we have like a two-step solution to status quo ante.
See, Mr. Haider, that is one way of looking at it, and but given the fact that the BJP is also going to have elections, Indian parliamentary elections, in next 2.5 years, or maybe 3 years, and there is also a very crucial election that is going to happen in the state of Uttar Pradesh, where Mr. Yogi Adityanath is facing anti-incumbency, and there have been large-scale deaths due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think that it could be a first step that restoration of statehood would happen, but in what form, that remains to be seen. Will it be a truncated form of statehood where it will be a Delhi-like arrangement where the law enforcement agencies will come under direct control of New Delhi? Or, what you are referring to, that will the Supreme Court act, and that could be a step 2 with regards to restoration of, Article 370. I think at this point in time, to me, it looks far-fetched because, 370, abrogation of 370 has been the core agenda of the Bharatiya Janata Party and its parent organization, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. And there is also some pressure being built by the Hindu militant organizations like Ikjut in Jammu, or the Kashmir, which is a party by a section of Kashmiri Pandits who call for emulation of Israeli-type model in Kashmir, and also even suggest carpet bombing of the Muslim Kashmir and creation of Panun Kashmir as a they have an ideological and civilizational view. But I think if there is international pressure and that sustains itself, and the way we saw the Galwan clashes at the line of actual control and what could happen on the line of control. So there are various factors that need to be factored in before we could move to that step 2. But I think it depends also on how the pro-India political parties like the National Conference, primarily because it's being the oldest party of Jammu and Kashmir, and the PDP, how they would be not with an apologetic tone, and and will they have the gravitas? Will they have the political will? Will they have will they summon courage to show spine and grow spine? Yeah,
those are very important questions, and also would determine whether they're actually prepared now, for whatever reason, to climb down on their original position with reference to restoration of Article 370. Dr. Dayal, how do you look at the situation? What can anyone possibly expect from this first interface between Mr. Modi and the Kashmiri politicians?
That was an excellent summation that my colleague gave of the current situation. I would like to point out 2 or 3 major issues that impact on all of this speculation. We must understand that the BJP government really cares 2 hoots for international pressure. It knows that it will get its arms, it will get what it wants because it's such a huge market. Internally also, it cares 2 hoots about the opposition, about anything else. Its agenda, as was just explained, is very clear. And thirdly, the Supreme Court, where so many of these things are stuck, so to say, unfortunately has laid down a line some years ago that it will rule in favor of what it calls the national sentiment, whether it's a rape case or a larger issue of Kashmir. And the national sentiment, as construed by the BJP and a very large number of Indian other political parties, is that Kashmir is an integral part of India. 370 has gone and it should never come back, and so on and so forth. They can differ on the severity of internet bans, they can differ on the severity of arrests and so forth, which are really largely minor things and flow out of the larger issue. So even in the case of restoration of statehood. What are we talking about? Will Ladakh be part of the state again? Or are we just talking about the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir being given some sort of statehood? Maybe with no police powers, maybe with police powers, but so minor as to require Amit Shah's imprimatur at every given moment. This is the larger scenario. But talks are a good thing. They are good eyeball trackers. They are good visual semantics. And it suits everybody that we are in a state of talks. It even allows Mufti to speak her language. If there were no talks, there would have been no occasion for her to lay down her life. So talks will be held in Delhi. Nothing will come out of it. But on the other hand, nothing aggravating will also come out of it. And I think whatever little hope comes from that. A third point I want to ask is, or rather say, is about the UP elections and how it has totally warped and poisoned every other issue in India, not just Kashmir. Normal Hindu-Muslim issues, normal Hindu-Christian issues, normal issues of the BJP and other political parties. There is an infight going on within the BJP on the issue of leadership in Uttar Pradesh, but that is minor compared to the large issue that the BJP needs to be seen as, again, the protector, the lead artist, the main general of Hindu Rashtra, Hindu pride, Hindu supremacy, and everybody else's pride, rights, and whatever else takes second or third or fourth place. And in the light of that, I think very minor optics can be expected from the talks day after tomorrow.
That's a pretty bleak picture. Gaur Geelani also more or less presented this picture, but let me pull in Ranjan Solomun here. Ms. Solomun, you heard Gaur Geelani, you heard Dr. Dayal. Dr. Dayal also mentioned to that unfortunate line in the Afzal Guru, verdict with reference to national sentiment. So, what is your sense? Is there a silver lining? Because so far, what I've heard is fairly pessimistic.
For me, my first question was, is this about optics? But then that's a bit cynical to think, because I think there is also some intent which we are not very clear about, because the BJP will never really show us all its cards. But I think there is, in some sense, an admission of failure in the BJP. Just the fact that they would sit and talk with the Gowhar alliance, is this an admission of failure? And that's my question. Is this a failure to restore normalcy? Something that they promised that they would do? They have failed. It's 2 years. Nothing has happened that should have happened. So I think this is one thing that I feel that has gone wrong with BJP policy. I think you have to put it alongside a number of other things that are happening in the country. Things aren't working for the BJP at all, especially with a big election coming up next year in UP. Before we know it, 2024 is going to come on us, and the BJP has to show something for itself. It has nothing to show for itself. Starting in 2014, all kinds of measures were taken, but they haven't produced the results that they... I think the BJP also realizes that, the world, and this is not just, they can say hell with Indian opinion, but I think there is world opinion that also says what you did was wrong, illegal, and even unconstitutional. The whole Article 370 issue is a matter of constitutionality also. So I think they have no choice but to restore it. But I think they need a face saver. What is the face saver? To say we are the good guys, look, we are also reasonable, that we will restore the status quo ante. I think this is one thing. I mean, our people, the Bidens and others, telling the Indian government, restore the Constitution because you have violated the Constitution. The Constitution supersedes any act of Parliament. And I don't know what kind of messages they're getting from elsewhere, but the rest of the world, I don't think, is just sitting and watching this. The US watches this because, yes, in the neighborhood, you have Afghanistan. And the US is running from there. And that leaves India very vulnerable. And so it's really now a one-point agenda, I think, that the Gowhar Alliance is asking for. Hand back power to us. It belongs here. We can't just take it away and then say we will make some adjustments. I think if they settle for small, minor adjustments and a little bit of reconciliation, which has no substance and which has no principles, no ethics, it will fall flat. This is not a banquet that they're going to. This cannot be a banquet. This has got to be hardball, talking serious stuff. Not give and take, but take back. And I think this is where the Gowhar Alliance should show what substance it's got. Their unity is an important thing, and I think it's very encouraging. But I don't think they're going to take, I hope they will not negotiate minus principles. Political principles must come first, and that's it.
Right. Very quickly, because I have almost run out of time. Gowhar Geelani, Solomun is saying, that India, the BJP government failed to do in occupied Kashmir by illegally annexing it. So therefore, they are under pressure to do something, and so they might want also as part of that to get the Gowhar politicians to sort of, who had shunned the BJP government so far after having been incarcerated, to at least get them on their side. So I want to get your very quick view on that. And also another very important point, are the Gowhar politicians even relevant now?
Two excellent questions, one after another. First is like these Gowhar parties have a history of compromises. You see Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, when he was incarcerated and put into prison for 22 long years in two separate stints from 1953 to 1974-75. And then under Indira Gandhi, when Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister in India, and he actually then, made a huge compromise in 1975 in the shape of Indira Abdullah Accord, which is also called Baig Partha Sarthi Accord, and he returned as Chief Minister after being dismissed as Prime Minister. And he also did a similar thing in 1947 and way back in 1939 when the nomenclature of the first political party was changed. So there is a history of compromises even with Dr. Farooq Abdullah, his son. And Omar Abdullah is very keen to engage with New Delhi, and he wants some sort of arrangement where some sort of political power, they are part of some kind of political power which they are so much used to for the last 7 decades. So the unity part that someone else alluded to, that will this alliance stick together and will they be united and uncompromising? That is a big question. Whether they can actually have that can speak from the position of strength, because what has happened to them with incarcerations and their own credibility in the eyes of the Kashmiri people, because they BJP wanted to paint them as the part of the Gowhar gang. And even Pakistani agents, but most Kashmiris see them as Delhi's agents in Kashmir who represent, Delhi in Kashmir and not the other way around. So these are very two important questions. But I think yes, there has been no headway as far as what the agenda of the BJP was to create an alternative reality in Kashmir and to cultivate a new crop of leadership. Which has absolutely failed. They have not been able to find an alternative.
Absolutely.
And that's why the Gowhar Alliance has become.
Those are the very important points that Ranjan Solomun raised. Very quickly, Dr. Dayal, because I've almost run out of time, with reference to the fact that the Gowhar alliance might just be irrelevant given where the Kashmiris now stand and given what has happened in the last 2 years. And of course, the point that that Mr. Solomun raised with reference to unity. So, quick last words from you before I wrap up.
I couldn't care less whether they're united or no. My immediate concern is always because there is some sort of a three-tier governance going on in Kashmir, which has also failed to devolve development and even sometimes food to people. But I would be very happy, and I think the people would also not curse as much if simple things are given to them, if the crackdowns are softer, if I may use that phrase, if internet is not disrupted, if young people are not harassed, if everyday life returns a bit to normalcy. I think that is far more important at this juncture than any larger issue that comes here in New Delhi. Because even if they say, okay, 5 months from now, we will have the current Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir made into a state. But meanwhile, we will continue to be as ruthless dictators as we always been. That serves no purpose. So I would say that the one thing that these people must also ask, apart from the larger picture, is that government, even if you say that Kashmir is an integral part of India, treat as you would like to treat every other Indian. Give them the facilities.
Okay.
Education.
Right. I get you, Dr. Dayal. I get your point. Thank you so much to Geelani, Dr. John Dayal, Mr. Ranjan, Solomun for their insights. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.